Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten truth behind the man whose 4 words reshaped a nation and the darker, more complicated story he never wanted told. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. There is something about the hour before sleep when the mind becomes willing to travel. Not urgently, not with purpose, but softly, the way a river moves through flat country, finding its way without hurrying. Tonight, let that traveling take you westward. Across open grass and distant ridgelines. Across a country that was still deciding what it wanted to be. Settle into wherever you are resting now. Feel the weight of the day releasing, slowly, from your shoulders, your hands, your jaw. We are going somewhere together, quietly, and there is no rush at all. Part 1, The Print Shop and the Dream. Imagine a young man's hands. Rough already, at 14, from cold and work and the particular roughness that comes from setting type by hand in a building that never quite holds heat in winter. The ink under the fingernails. The smell of it, iron and oil, and something sharp underneath, something that almost burns if you breathe too deeply. The sound of the press itself, a rhythmic thudding that you stop hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing rain on a roof, until suddenly you notice it again and realize it has been speaking to you the whole time. That young man's name was Horace Greeley, and the year was somewhere around 1825, in the small town of East Pulteney, Vermont. He had come there almost as a ghost comes, thin, pale, dressed in clothes that did not quite fit him, carrying a small bundle of what he owned. He had walked a considerable distance, and before that, his family had moved, and before that, his childhood had been the kind that leaves marks not because it was cruel, but because it was hard in the ordinary, grinding way that life was hard for most people in early 19th century New England. Horace had been born on February 3, 1811, in Amherst, New Hampshire. His father, Zacchaeus Greeley, was a farmer of modest means and considerable misfortune. Zacchaeus worked hard and seemed perpetually unable to get ahead. The land would not cooperate, the weather would turn, the prices would shift just when they shouldn't have. His mother, Mary Woodburn Greeley, was by all accounts a determined and quietly fierce woman who read to her children and believed, as some people in that era did with a kind of burning certainty, that the printed word was a form of salvation. Not only religious salvation, though that mattered too, but something broader, the idea that knowing things, reading things, understanding the world through language, was the path out of poverty, out of smallness, out of being forgotten by history. Horace seems to have absorbed this belief completely and irrevocably before he was old enough to question it. He was reading at 3. Reading seriously, reading widely, reading the way some children play, with total absorption, without needing to be told to, without needing to be rewarded. Neighbors in Amherst reportedly found this mildly unsettling in the way that exceptional children sometimes unsettle the people around them, not because they are threatening, but because they are somehow already elsewhere, already half living in a world the people around them cannot quite see. The family struggles deepened when Horace was still young. Zacchaeus Greeley eventually lost the farm, a common story in New England, where the rocky soil and harsh winters made agriculture an unforgiving occupation. The family moved several times, eventually settling for a period in Vermont, and it was in this context of rootlessness and financial difficulty that young Horace came to East Pulteney to begin his apprenticeship at the Northern Spectator. He was 15, more or less. The exact age is slightly uncertain, as these things often were in a time when formal records were kept sporadically and family memory did the rest. What is certain is what happened to him there. The print shop became his university. Not metaphorically, he had received almost no formal schooling, and the print shop genuinely was the place where he learned what he would spend his life doing. He learned to set type, which in those days meant arranging individual metal letters one by one in a composing stick, reading them backwards so they would print forward, building a line of text the way a mason builds a wall, letter by letter, space by space. It was painstaking work, physically demanding, requiring a particular combination of patience and precision that most people either have or they do not. Horace had it. He was fast, and he was accurate, and he was absorbing everything the newspaper printed before he printed it. That last part is important. Every piece of copy that passed through his hands, he read. Every editorial, every political dispatch, every letter to the editor, every report from distant places about things happening in the wider world, he consumed it all. By the time he was 17 or 18, he had an education that was unusual and difficult to categorize, deeply impractical in some ways, breathtakingly broad in others. He knew nothing of Latin or Greek, nothing of mathematics beyond the basic, but he understood the texture of public debate in ways that many formally educated men of his era did not. He understood how language shaped opinion. He understood how a well-placed phrase could move a reader, could shift the emotional temperature of an argument, could make an abstract idea feel immediate and personal. The Northern Spectator folded in 1830, as many small newspapers did in that era. Horace was 19, suddenly unemployed, and faced with a choice that would have been paralyzing for many young men of his background and circumstances. He had no family money, no connections, no property. He had his skills and his conviction, and he had, somewhere deep in his chest, something that is difficult to name precisely, a kind of restless, almost impatient faith in the power of words to change things. He decided to go to New York City. This was not a simple decision in 1831. New York was large and overwhelming and expensive, and it chewed up young men from the country with considerable efficiency. The city streets were nothing like Vermont's quiet lanes. They were loud and crowded and smelled of horses and garbage and river water and the particular sourness of many people living in close quarters without adequate sanitation. The buildings pressed in. The noise was constant. And the newspaper business in New York was already competitive in ways that would have disheartened anyone with a clear view of the odds. Horace apparently did not have a clear view of the odds, or perhaps he simply did not care about them in the way that most people do. He arrived in New York with $10, or possibly less, accounts differ on the precise amount, wearing clothes that made him look even more out of place in the city than he actually was, which was saying something. He was tall and thin, with a large head that seemed slightly too large even for his tall frame, and pale blue eyes that people who met him later described as having an unsettling quality of looking past you and through you simultaneously, as though he were always thinking about three things at once. He found work as a journeyman printer, moving from shop to shop, earning just enough to survive, living in the cheapest possible rooms, eating the cheapest possible food, saving what he could. And he was watching. Studying the city. Reading everything he could get his hands on. Developing opinions about everything, about politics, about poverty, about the way the city's wealth was distributed so unevenly that you could walk from a block where men wore silk waistcoats to a block where children slept on the street, with no apparent discomfort on anyone's part about this arrangement. In 1833, Horace Greeley made his first attempt at running a newspaper. He was 22 years old. The paper was called the Morning Post, and it lasted 11 days. This is not, as it might seem, a story of failure, or at least, it is not only that. The Morning Post failed for practical reasons, mostly financial, and Horace absorbed the lesson and moved on with remarkable speed and equanimity. He was not a man who spent much time on regret. He was too busy thinking about what came next. And what were those questions? The 1830s and 1840s in America were a time of extraordinary turbulence and possibility simultaneously. The country was expanding at a pace that felt almost vertiginous to those living through it. New states were being admitted to the Union. The frontier was always moving westward, pushing into territory that was variously claimed, contested, settled, and unsettled. The question of slavery was not yet the consuming crisis it would become, but it was present, always present, a deep uncomfortable pressure beneath the surface of nearly every political conversation. The rise of industrialism was transforming the lives of ordinary workers in the Northeast. Immigration was changing the character of the cities. The old certainties of the founding generation were giving way to something new and not yet fully formed. Horace Greeley was watching all of it, writing about all of it, forming opinions about all of it with the particular intensity of a man who believes that what he thinks and writes actually matters. And slowly, steadily, in the small rooms where he worked by lamplight, in the print shops where the presses ran through the night, something was taking shape, something larger than a literary journal, something that would eventually become one of the most influential newspapers in American history. Part 2: The Tribune is born. There is a moment in the early spring of 1841 when everything changes, and it arrives not with ceremony but with the ordinary practicality of a man sitting down with a small amount of borrowed money and deciding to begin. The morning air would have been cold still, the way April is cold in New York before the warmth truly settles, and the streets would have been waking up around him, the carters making their early runs, the bakers already deep in their work, the city assembling itself for another day with its characteristic indifference to any single individual's ambitions. On April 10, 1841, Horace Greeley published the first issue of the New York Tribune. He was 30 years old. He had $1,000 in capital, some of it borrowed, and a vision that was both entirely practical and somewhat grandiose, as the best visions tend to be. He wanted to create a newspaper that would be both serious and accessible, a paper that working people could afford to read, that would treat them as intelligent adults capable of engaging with complex ideas, but that would not drown them in the kind of dense, pompous prose that characterized so many publications of the era. The penny press had been around for a few years by this point. Benjamin Day's New York Sun, founded in 1833, and James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald, founded in 1835, had demonstrated that you could sell newspapers cheaply and make money on volume rather than subscription. But Greeley had something different in mind. He was not interested simply in sensation, in the crime and scandal and titillating gossip that drove much of the penny press's circulation. He wanted a newspaper that stood for something, that had principles it was willing to defend even when those principles were unpopular. The paper found its audience quickly. Within months, circulation was growing steadily. Within a year or two, the Tribune was one of the most widely read newspapers in New York. Part of this success was practical. Greeley was a genuinely gifted editor with a talent for recognizing good writing and a willingness to publish opinions that diverged from the safe middle. Part of it was the moment. New York in the early 1840s was hungry for serious journalism, for a paper that would engage with the real questions of the day rather than simply entertaining its readers with sensation. What were Greeley's own politics at this point? They are worth understanding because they were both deeply felt and somewhat complicated, in the way that genuinely independent minds tend to be complicated. He was a Whig, a supporter of Henry Clay, broadly speaking, in the tradition of American political economy that believed in strong national institutions, protective tariffs, internal improvements, and a somewhat ordered and deliberate approach to national development. This put him at odds with the Jacksonian Democrats who dominated much of American political life in this era and who tended toward a more aggressive individualism and a more suspicious view of federal power. But Greeley's Whiggery was never a simple party loyalty. He was too restless, too genuinely curious, too unwilling to simply accept the conventional positions of his political allies. He had been deeply influenced by the ideas of the utopian socialist Charles Fourier, not directly, but through the American social reformer Albert Brisbane, who was writing for the Tribune in its early years and who filled Greeley's head with ideas about cooperative labor and the reorganization of society on more equitable principles. Greeley was never a strict socialist in any systematic sense, but he believed with considerable passion that the economic arrangements of mid-19th century America were producing unnecessary suffering, and that this suffering was neither inevitable nor acceptable. He was also, from the Tribune's earliest days, an opponent of slavery. Not yet in the radical abolitionist terms that would come later, in the early 1840s, Greeley was more of a gradual emancipationist who believed the institution should be contained and eventually phased out, rather than an immediate abolitionist who demanded its instant end. But the moral position was clear and consistent. He believed slavery was wrong. He believed it was incompatible with the principles on which the country had been founded, and he was willing to say so in print at a time when this was not a universally popular position even in the North. The Tribune's editorial staff in its early years was a remarkable collection of minds. Greeley had a gift for attracting talented writers, partly because he was willing to publish unconventional ideas and partly because working for the Tribune felt like working for something that mattered. Among those who wrote for the paper in its early years were Margaret Fuller, the transcendentalist author and feminist thinker, who served as the Tribune's literary editor from 1844 to 1846 and brought to the paper a breadth of intellectual engagement that was genuinely unusual for American journalism of the time. Fuller wrote about European politics, about women's rights, about literature and philosophy, with a combination of erudition and accessibility that perfectly matched Greeley's editorial vision. In 1848, the Tribune would add a name that would become famous far beyond its American context: Karl Marx. The German philosopher and his collaborator Friedrich Engels had published the Communist Manifesto that year, and while Marx was in no sense a mainstream figure in American public life, Greeley's commitment to publishing unconventional ideas led him to hire Marx as the Tribune's European correspondent beginning in 1851. Marx would write for the Tribune for more than a decade, producing pieces on European politics and economics that were widely read and that, somewhat ironically, helped support him financially during some of the leanest years of his life in London. The arrangement is one of the stranger footnotes in the history of American journalism, the country's most influential mainstream newspaper helping to underwrite the intellectual work of the man who would become the founding figure of international communism. Part 3: Go West, Young Man. There is a phrase that has followed Horace Greeley through history the way a shadow follows a man in late afternoon, always present, always just slightly larger than the man himself, not quite his but inseparable from him. Go west, young man. Go west and grow up with the country. Most people who know anything about Horace Greeley know this phrase. And most of what they know about it is slightly wrong, in the way that famous quotations tend to accumulate a kind of simplified authority that the actual history doesn't entirely support. Let us sit with the real story for a moment, because it is more interesting than the simple version, and because the complications tell us something important about how ideas move through a culture and how credit gets assigned and sometimes misassigned in the process. The phrase "go west, young man" appears to have originated not with Horace Greeley but with a man named Jean-Baptiste Lane Sol, who published it in 1851 in the Terre Haute Express, an Indiana newspaper. Sol wrote, "Go west, young man, go west." It was a brief editorial sentiment, the kind of thing that appeared in regional newspapers of the era with some regularity, because the sentiment itself, that westward migration was the path to opportunity and renewal, was very much in the air throughout the 1840s and 1850s in America. Greeley did not write the original phrase, but he did publish something very close to it in the Tribune, and more importantly, he spent years and years championing the idea behind it with such energy and conviction that the phrase came to be associated with him in the public mind. He wrote, on various occasions, variations of the sentiment, encouraging young men who were struggling in the overcrowded cities of the East to consider the opportunities of the West, arguing that the land and the open space of the frontier offered a form of freedom and possibility that the industrial economy of the cities could not provide. When people quoted "Go West, young man" and attributed it to Greeley, they were, in a sense, accurately describing his position even if they were misattributing the specific words. Greeley himself eventually acknowledged that the original phrasing was Sol's, and he tried at various points to set the record straight. But the correction never fully took hold. The phrase was too perfectly associated with the man, too consistent with everything he had been saying for years, too fitting for the public image he had created. History absorbed the attribution and kept it, and in some important sense, the attribution is not wrong even if the specific words were not his. The spirit behind them was as thoroughly Greeley's as anything he ever wrote. What did it mean to go west in the 1840s and 1850s? We should spend some time with this question, because the west of Greeley's imagination and the west of historical reality were related but not identical, and the gap between them is itself a significant part of the story. The west of Greeley's imagination was a place of possibility, clean and open and waiting, a landscape where a man who was willing to work could make something of himself that the crowded, hierarchical East would not allow. It was a vision deeply rooted in the agrarian idealism of Thomas Jefferson, who had believed that a democracy of small farmers was the healthiest form of republic, and in the specific conditions of mid-19th century America, where the cities were rapidly filling with immigrants and the urban poor, where the gap between wealth and poverty was visibly widening, and where the frontier still seemed to offer an alternative to the growing inequalities of the industrial order. In a very practical sense, Greeley was responding to real conditions. New York in the 1840s was a city under enormous pressure. Waves of immigration, particularly from Ireland and Germany following the upheavals of the 1840s, the Irish famine, the failed revolutions of 1848, were pouring people into a city that could not absorb them quickly enough. The Five Points neighborhood, just a short walk from the Tribune's offices on Nassau Street, was by the mid-1840s one of the most densely populated and desperately poor urban neighborhoods in the Western world. Families were crowded into tenements where disease moved easily and quickly. Children worked in factories and on the streets. The structures of mutual support that had sustained traditional communities had not yet been rebuilt in the chaotic conditions of the immigrant city. When Greeley looked at this and wrote about westward migration as a solution, he was not being naive or not entirely naive. He understood that the West was not a magic answer. He understood that homesteading was hard, that the land was not free in any simple sense, that frontier life had its own particular brutalities and failures. He was not selling a fantasy. But he believed, with what we might describe as a kind of qualified optimism, that the difficulties of the West were at least the difficulties of an open landscape rather than the difficulties of a sealed-off poverty, and that given a genuine choice, the open landscape was preferable. There was, of course, something deeply problematic about the vision, though it was not something that Greeley, or most white Americans of his era, saw clearly. The West was not empty. It had never been empty. The land that American settlers were moving onto had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years, and the process of westward expansion was, in its practical effects, a process of dispossession conducted through military force, disease, broken treaties, and systematic violence. The freedom that the frontier offered to white settlers was in significant part constructed on the destruction of existing communities and ways of life. Greeley's position on this was complex and, by modern standards, deeply inadequate. He was not indifferent to the indigenous peoples of the West. He met with various native leaders over the years, wrote about them with a degree of genuine curiosity and some sympathy, and expressed discomfort with some of the more blatant atrocities of frontier expansion. But he never fundamentally challenged the project of westward settlement itself, never argued that the land should not be settled by white Americans, never made indigenous rights a central concern of his journalism in the way that he made anti-slavery a central concern. He was a man of his time in this respect, which is to say that he shared the enormous blind spot that most white Americans of his era had about what westward expansion was actually doing to the people who had been there first. But within its complicated context, the idea of going west was genuinely powerful and genuinely transformative for the people it reached. The Tribune's weekly edition, the paper Greeley created specifically to reach readers outside New York, had a circulation that eventually reached 200,000 copies, an enormous number for the mid-19th century. It went everywhere, to farms in Ohio and Indiana, to small towns in Illinois, to the frontier settlements of Missouri and Iowa, to the camps of men working the Great Plains and the mountains beyond. It was read aloud in general stores and passed from hand to hand in households where one copy had to serve many readers. And in issue after issue, it made the case for the West, for its possibilities, for its freedoms, for its promise of something better than what so many people had left behind. The people who acted on this vision were not abstractions. They were real men and women, each carrying their particular circumstances and hopes and fears. A young couple from Pennsylvania, selling a farm that barely covered its debts and loading everything they owned onto a wagon. A German immigrant in Cincinnati, 5 years in America and still not quite finding the foothold he had imagined, reading the Tribune's words about land to the West and feeling something shift in his thinking. A young woman from New England, watching her brothers leave one by one and wondering what form of possibility was available to her in a world that offered women far fewer choices than it offered men. These were Greeley's readers. These were the people his words reached. And even if the phrase "go west," young man was not precisely his, the spirit of it was, and it moved through the country like weather, like something in the air that everyone was already breathing before they quite noticed it had changed. Part 4: The Man Behind the Paper. Greeley was, by most accounts, a difficult man to know in certain ways and a completely transparent man in others. He had very little interest in social performance, in saying the expected things or playing the social roles that his increasing prominence might have demanded. He dressed badly, spectacularly, almost heroically badly, in a way that became a kind of public signature. The white coat he wore in his later years, somewhat rumpled, somehow always appearing slightly too large or slightly too small, was famous in New York in a way that few items of clothing are famous. People recognized him on the street not because he looked like a great man, but because he looked like himself, which was a specific and unmistakable thing. He was absent-minded with the particular quality of the genuinely preoccupied. He would forget appointments, misplace important documents, leave for work in the morning without things he had meant to bring, lose track of time entirely when he was reading or writing. His offices at the Tribune were, by multiple contemporary accounts, in a state of organized chaos that baffled visitors and apparently functioned perfectly well for its inhabitant. He knew where everything was, or he thought he did, which may or may not be the same thing. In 1836, Greeley had married Mary Youngs Cheney, a schoolteacher from Connecticut whom he had met in New York. The marriage was, by most accounts, a union of two very strong-willed people who loved each other and also made each other miserable with some regularity. Mary Greeley was an intelligent, passionate woman with firm views on a variety of subjects, including diet. She was a committed vegetarian at a time when this was quite eccentric, and the proper upbringing of children, on which she and her husband disagreed frequently. She was also subject to periods of severe depression and physical illness that placed enormous pressure on the household. The Greeleys had several children, most of whom died in infancy or early childhood. This was not unusual in 19th-century America, where childhood mortality was high and every family knew grief in this particular form, but knowing that a thing was common does not make it easier to bear. The deaths of his children marked Greeley deeply, and the tenderness that appears in his private correspondence about these losses is sometimes startling in contrast to the combative public figure he presented to the world. The couple eventually built a farm in Chappaqua, New York, where Mary retreated increasingly as the years went on, preferring the country to the city and perhaps preferring some distance from her husband's increasingly all-consuming professional life. Greeley was a devoted, if often absent, provider. He made money, he spent money, he sent money home, he came home when he could. The physical distance between his work life and his family life seems to have been a condition of his existence rather than a choice he made consciously, though the distinction between those two things is sometimes not as clear as we would like it to be. What did he do with himself when he was not working? This is actually a difficult question to answer, because the evidence suggests that he was almost always working. He was one of those people for whom work is not a category separate from life but a condition of being alive. He thought about the paper constantly, wrote constantly, talked about ideas constantly. Visitors who came to see him reported that the conversation was intense and stimulating and also somewhat exhausting, because Greeley never quite stopped being Greeley even in casual social settings. He had opinions about everything, and he shared them with a directness that some people found refreshing and others found overbearing. He was also, despite his intensity, genuinely kind in individual interactions. People who worked for him at the Tribune spoke with consistent warmth about his generosity. He paid salaries on time even when the paper's finances were strained. He was willing to give second chances to people who had disappointed him. He took an interest in the lives of his employees that went beyond their professional usefulness. He was the kind of boss who remembered your mother was ill and asked after her, who noticed when you seemed unhappy and said something, who treated the people around him as individuals rather than instruments. This quality coexisted with his public combativeness in a way that might seem paradoxical but actually makes a certain kind of sense. The same attentiveness to actual human beings that made him kind in person also made him furious about systems and arrangements that caused unnecessary human suffering. His physical health was, for much of his life, precarious. He drove himself relentlessly and ate irregularly and slept too little and worried constantly, and the combination took its toll. He suffered from headaches of a severity that would today probably be diagnosed as migraines. He went through periods of profound exhaustion that he described in his private letters with a candor and vulnerability that is moving to read, periods when he wondered whether he had the strength to keep going, when the weight of everything he had committed himself to felt like it might simply be too much for one man to carry. There is something in this picture of Horace Greeley, the rumpled clothes, the absent-minded intensity, the private kindness, the public combativeness, the grief held quietly alongside the conviction that is recognizably human in a way that makes him accessible across the distance of more than a century and a half. He was not a saint, and he was not a simple idealist. He was a man who had come from almost nothing and built something significant, who believed in things and said so, who made mistakes and carried losses and kept working. The greatness of such people is not usually in their perfection. It is in their persistence. Part 5: Anti-Slavery and the Road to Crisis. If there is a single issue that runs through the whole of Horace Greeley's public life like a seam of iron through stone, it is the question of slavery. Not smoothly or simply or without contradiction, nothing about slavery in antebellum America was smooth or simple, but persistently, year after year, in ways that shaped the Tribune's editorial character and contributed materially to the national crisis that would culminate in the Civil War. Greeley's anti-slavery position developed gradually over the course of the 1840s and 1850s, moving from the relatively moderate gradual emancipationism of his early years toward a more urgent and demanding opposition as the political situation deteriorated. Understanding this development requires understanding the political landscape of those decades, which was shifting with a speed and violence that made it difficult for anyone to find stable ground. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had established a fragile equilibrium between slave states and free states by drawing a geographic line across the continent. Slavery would be permitted south of a certain latitude, prohibited north of it. For 2 decades, this arrangement had held, uneasily, fraying at the edges but not quite coming apart. Then the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 changed everything by adding an enormous swath of new territory to the United States, and immediately raised the question, would these new territories be slave or free? Greeley had opposed the Mexican-American War from the beginning, seeing it, as many Whigs did, as an act of aggressive expansionism driven by Southern slaveholders' hunger for new territory to extend their institution. The Tribune's coverage of the war was sharply critical, and Greeley's editorials made no attempt to disguise his view that the war was both unjust in its origins and dangerous in its consequences. He was right about the consequences, though the full extent of that rightness would not be clear until decades later. The Compromise of 1850, negotiated by the aging Henry Clay with the assistance of Daniel Webster and Stephen Douglas, was another attempt to paper over the fundamental division in American political life with a package of measures that gave something to both sides. For the South, a stronger fugitive slave law, requiring northern states to assist in the return of escaped enslaved people. For the North, the admission of California as a free state and the organization of New Mexico and Utah territories without an explicit slavery clause. For Greeley, a clear indication that the compromise was not sufficient and that the fugitive slave law in particular was morally intolerable. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 galvanized anti-slavery feeling in the North in ways that its Southern architects had not entirely anticipated. Abstract opposition to slavery was one thing, being legally compelled to participate in the capture and return of human beings who had escaped bondage was another. The Tribune's coverage of cases under the fugitive slave law, and there were many, as Southern slaveholders moved quickly to use the new provisions, was detailed, emotional, and deliberately designed to make the reality of slavery felt by readers who might otherwise have kept it at a comfortable intellectual distance. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had first appeared in serial form in an anti-slavery newspaper. The novel sold in extraordinary numbers and shifted public sentiment about slavery in the North with a speed and power that is difficult to fully account for in purely rational terms. Greeley's Tribune championed the book enthusiastically, reviewing it with great warmth and pushing its significance in exactly the terms that Stowe herself had hoped for. The relationship between Greeley's journalism and Stowe's fiction was not accidental. Both were working in the same cultural space, trying to move the same moral needle, and the convergence of the novel and the newspaper amplified both. Then came Kansas-Nebraska. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced legislation that would organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories on a principle of popular sovereignty. The people of each territory would vote on whether to allow slavery, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise's prohibition of slavery north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes line. Douglas's motives were partly practical. He wanted to organize the territories to facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad, and partly political. The Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, and it set off a storm that Greeley had been anticipating and dreading. The Tribune's response was immediate and furious. Greeley understood, with a clarity that many of his contemporaries did not yet share, that Kansas-Nebraska had fundamentally broken the existing political order. The Whig Party, already weakened by years of attempting to straddle the slavery question, was essentially finished. The Democratic Party was fracturing along sectional lines. Something new was needed, and Greeley was among the first and most energetic advocates for the formation of the Republican Party, which coalesced in 1854 and 1855 from the wreckage of the Whigs and the anti-slavery fragments of other political alignments. The Tribune became, in the late 1850s, one of the most important platforms for the new Republican coalition. Greeley's editorials shaped the party's messaging. His reporting on the violence in Kansas, Bleeding Kansas, as it came to be known, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought a guerrilla civil war over the territory's fate, brought the horror of what was happening to a national audience, and his support for Republican candidates gave the party a credibility and visibility that it desperately needed in its early years. It was in this context that Greeley first encountered Abraham Lincoln. The two men knew each other slightly from Lincoln's single term in Congress in the late 1840s, where Lincoln had been an undistinguished Whig representative from Illinois. By the late 1850s, Lincoln was a rising figure in Illinois Republican politics, and the Tribune was watching. Greeley's relationship with Lincoln was complicated, warm at some moments and contentious at others, and it would become one of the defining relationships of both men's political lives as the crisis deepened. The year 1858 brought the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the series of 7 encounters between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas as they campaigned for the Illinois Senate seat. Greeley's Tribune covered the debates extensively and sympathetically toward Lincoln, though Greeley's own preferred candidate for the 1860 Republican presidential nomination was not Lincoln. Greeley had his own political preferences and his own political calculations, and they did not always align with what turned out to be the correct assessment of the moment. Then came 1859, and John Brown, and Harper's Ferry. John Brown's raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, on October 16, 1859, was an attempt to trigger a general slave uprising by seizing weapons and distributing them to enslaved people in the surrounding region. The raid was suppressed within 2 days, Brown was captured, tried, and hanged, and the South was thrown into a state of near panic about the implications of what had happened. Here was a white Northerner who had not merely opposed slavery in print but had taken up arms against it, who had killed people for it, who went to his death calmly and declared that he had done right. Greeley's response to Harper's Ferry was careful and revealing. He did not endorse the raid, he was not willing to defend political violence as a method, and he was conscious that endorsing Brown would damage the Republican cause in ways that would be counterproductive. But he did not condemn Brown the man. He wrote about Brown with a respect that bordered on reverence, called him misguided rather than wicked, and made clear that while the means were wrong, the cause was right. It was a delicate position that attempted to hold together moral condemnation of violence and moral acknowledgement of the cause that had driven Brown to it, and it satisfied no one entirely, which is often the fate of honest positions in times of crisis. By 1860, the country was at the edge of something that no compromise would stop. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November of that year, on a Republican platform that opposed the extension of slavery, triggered the secession of South Carolina before the year was out, followed by the other Deep South states in quick succession. Greeley had spent 2 decades arguing in print that the crisis could not be indefinitely avoided, and now it had arrived, in all the terrible reality that he had warned about and that still managed to be more terrible than warning had prepared anyone for. Part 6: War, Anguish, and the Editor's Burden. The first morning light of April 1861 came to New York as it always did, gradually, through the particular quality of early spring air that carries in it both the cold of the winter just past and the warmth of what is coming. Along Nassau Street, where the Tribune's offices stood, the sound of the city assembling itself for the day was already underway. But something was different. Something in the air felt different. The news from Charleston was moving through the telegraph wires, and before the first editions were printed, everyone who worked in the newspaper business in New York knew that the attack on Fort Sumter had begun. War had come. The thing that Horace Greeley had been writing about and arguing about and trying to prevent for 20 years had come, and now the only question was what you did with it. Greeley's position in the early months of the war was complex, even contradictory in some ways, and it brought him into a direct and painful confrontation with Abraham Lincoln that has been analyzed and debated by historians ever since. Understanding it requires holding several things in mind simultaneously: Greeley's genuine anti-slavery convictions, his equally genuine desire for peace, his complicated relationship with Lincoln, and the enormous pressure that the Tribune's readership placed on him to say clearly what the war was for. Before the attack on Fort Sumter, during the secession crisis, Greeley had taken a position that surprised many of his readers and infuriated many of his allies. He had written, essentially, that if the Southern states wanted to leave the Union, perhaps they should be allowed to leave peacefully, that the cost of holding them in the Union by force might be greater than the cost of acknowledging the separation. This position was in part a strategic argument. Greeley believed that a Southern Confederacy could not survive economically without access to Northern markets and capital, and that the separation would lead fairly quickly to negotiated reunion, and in part a genuine moral reluctance to see the country go to war. The attack on Fort Sumter changed everything. Once the shooting started, Greeley was an unequivocal supporter of the Union cause. The Tribune called loudly and repeatedly for aggressive prosecution of the war, for mobilization of the North's superior resources, for the determination to see the conflict through to a decisive conclusion. And it called, increasingly and urgently, for emancipation, for the war to be made explicitly a war against slavery as well as a war for the Union, for Lincoln to take the step that Greeley believed would both justify the enormous cost in lives and blood and significantly weaken the Confederacy by encouraging enslaved people to flee or resist. The relationship between Greeley and Lincoln during the war was one of the most fascinating and difficult relationships in American political history. They had known each other for years, respected each other, and disagreed with each other in ways that were both productive and infuriating to both parties. Lincoln was a man of enormous patience and political calculation, who moved toward emancipation deliberately and carefully, timing each step with a consciousness of what the political situation would bear. Greeley was a man of enormous impatience and moral urgency, who believed that deliberate and careful movement in the face of an obvious moral crisis was a form of complicity with that crisis. On August 20, 1862, Greeley published in the Tribune an open letter to Lincoln titled The Prayer of 20 Millions. It was one of the most famous documents in American journalistic history, a passionate, demanding address to the president, made public before the president had even received it privately, laying out in detail the grievances of the anti-slavery Republican constituency that the Tribune represented. Greeley argued that Lincoln was failing his supporters, failing the country, and failing the cause of freedom by his reluctance to move decisively against slavery as an institution. The letter was blunt, almost harsh in its directness, and it placed Lincoln in the uncomfortable position of having to respond publicly to a public challenge from one of his most important press supporters. Lincoln's response, 4 days later, is one of the most carefully crafted pieces of political communication in American history. He wrote, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that, and if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." What Lincoln did not tell Greeley, what he could not yet tell the public, was that he had already drafted the Emancipation Proclamation and was waiting for a Union military victory to give him the political ground on which to issue it. He was not disagreeing with Greeley about the destination. He was disagreeing about the timing. Less than a month later, the Union victory at Antietam gave Lincoln the moment he needed, and on September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Greeley's Tribune greeted the announcement with something close to joy, the joy of a man who has argued for something for years and finally seen it acknowledged, even if in a more limited form than he had hoped for, even if the practical effects would take time to be felt. The proclamation, as Greeley well understood, freed enslaved people only in Confederate-held territories, not in the border states that had remained in the Union, not in areas of the South already under Union control. It was a war measure, legally speaking, rather than a comprehensive abolition of slavery, and the full legal end of slavery would require the 13th Amendment, which was still years away. But it changed the moral character of the war in ways that could not be reversed, and it represented a movement toward the position that Greeley had been advocating since the Tribune's earliest days. The war years were exhausting for Greeley in ways that went beyond the simple pressure of work. The casualty lists that appeared in the Tribune week after week, the names of the dead that kept multiplying beyond any number that anyone had imagined when the fighting started, the political divisions and scandals and betrayals and disappointments, all of it accumulated. He had never been robust, and the war ground him down further. He continued to write, continued to argue, continued to push Lincoln from the left even as he supported the Union cause, but the letters from this period show a weariness that is palpable across the distance of time. He also, in a move that would damage his reputation significantly, allowed himself to be drawn into a secret and ultimately futile peace negotiation in 1864. Lincoln, facing a presidential election in November and uncertain of victory, authorized Greeley to make contact with Confederate agents in Niagara, Canada, who claimed to have peace proposals from Jefferson Davis. Greeley went, met with the agents, and found, as Lincoln had suspected he would find, that the Confederate position required recognition of Confederate independence as a precondition, which was entirely unacceptable. The whole episode was mishandled and embarrassing, and it exposed Greeley to criticism from both sides, Southerners who saw it as a cynical political maneuver by Lincoln, Northerners who saw it as naive peace-seeking in the middle of a war. Greeley's standing suffered, and he knew it. And yet the war continued, as wars do, past the point where any individual's reputation mattered much. Sherman marched through Georgia. Grant pressed Lee in Virginia. And on April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, it ended or the fighting ended, which is not quite the same thing, though it felt like an ending then. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater, and Greeley, who had argued with Lincoln and supported Lincoln and criticized Lincoln and needed Lincoln in ways he may not have entirely understood, sat down to write an editorial about a man who was gone before they had finished their argument. Part 7: Reconstruction and the World Rebuilt. The spring after a great war has a particular quality. There is relief, genuine and deep, and grief, genuine and deep, and underneath both of them a kind of disorientation. The world has been rearranged, violently and permanently, and the people living in it have to figure out what comes next without quite having the conceptual vocabulary to describe what they are navigating. For Horace Greeley in the spring of 1865, the question of what came next was both a personal one and a public one, as it always was for a man whose personal and public lives were so thoroughly intertwined. He was 54 years old. He had been running the Tribune for 24 years. He had lost children and gained and lost political allies and watched the country tear itself nearly in half and begin to be sutured back together. What did he believe about how that suturing should be done? Greeley's Reconstruction politics are among the most interesting and controversial aspects of his career, and they represent a genuine evolution, or perhaps more accurately, a genuine complication of his earlier positions. In the immediate aftermath of the war, he was committed to Reconstruction in its robust form, the protection of the rights of formerly enslaved people, the punishment of Confederate leaders, the comprehensive transformation of Southern society to make it compatible with the free labor principles the war had theoretically established. He supported the radical Republicans in their confrontation with Andrew Johnson, whose lenient approach to Reconstruction represented, in Greeley's view, a betrayal of what the war had been fought for. But then something shifted. It shifted gradually and not entirely consistently, and it is difficult even now to say exactly why it happened, whether it was genuine moral conviction, political calculation, personal exhaustion, or some combination of all three. Greeley began to argue that the South needed to be reintegrated into the national community rather than perpetually punished, that the spirit of reconciliation should temper the demands of justice, that the former Confederate states and their white citizens needed to be brought back into the democratic process as full participants if the country was to function as a country. This position led him, in 1867, to one of the most controversial acts of his later career. He signed the bail bond for Jefferson Davis, who had been imprisoned since the end of the war and was awaiting trial for treason. Davis had never been tried. The federal government was having difficulty constructing a prosecution that would succeed in court, and the question of what to do with him was becoming a prolonged embarrassment. Greeley's decision to sign his bail bond, along with a group of other prominent figures, was an act of deliberate reconciliationist symbolism, and it was received in the North with a fury that Greeley had not quite anticipated. The criticism was fierce and deeply personal. Many of the men and women who had supported the Tribune for years felt betrayed. Veterans of the Union Army were particularly outraged. To them, Jefferson Davis was the man responsible for everything they had suffered, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of their comrades, and the idea of Horace Greeley facilitating his freedom was an obscenity. Subscription cancellations poured in. Long-standing allies broke publicly with the paper. Greeley defended himself in print with his usual directness, but the damage was real. Why did he do it? The question is worth sitting with for a moment, because the easy answer, that he had simply been captured by the Southern cause, that he had forgotten what the war was about, does not quite account for the evidence. Greeley had not stopped caring about the rights of Black Americans. though his engagement with the practical work of securing those rights had become more complicated. He believed, with some sincerity, that reconciliation between the sections was a genuine prerequisite for the kind of national renewal that would actually improve conditions in the South, including conditions for black Southerners. He may have been wrong about this, and the subsequent history of Reconstruction's failure and the rise of Jim Crow suggests that he was wrong, that reconciliation without meaningful protection of black rights led to the reconstruction of racial hierarchy rather than its dismantlement. But he was not cynically trading away black freedom for political advantage. He was trying to think his way through an enormously difficult problem and arriving at conclusions that, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see were insufficient. The 1860s also brought significant changes to the Tribune itself. The paper was growing and professionalizing. New staff, new sections, new technologies of production that made the paper larger and more elaborate. The telegraph had transformed journalism. News from distant places arrived in hours rather than days, and newspapers had to process and contextualize a volume of information that previous generations of editors had never confronted. Greeley was not always well suited to the new conditions. He had built the Tribune on the strength of his own editorial vision, and that vision was both the paper's greatest asset and a constraint on its development. It was difficult to separate what the paper was from what Greeley personally believed, and as his own positions became more complicated and more controversial, the paper's identity became correspondingly complicated. There were also changes in the broader newspaper landscape that challenged the Tribune's dominance. The Associated Press wire service was changing how news was gathered and distributed, making it harder for any single paper to distinguish itself simply on the basis of better reporting. The New York Times, founded in 1851, was growing in stature and competing for the kind of serious readership that the Tribune had long considered its own. The Herald remained a powerful competitor, and new papers were emerging all the time, reaching for different audiences and different niches. The world outside was changing too, in ways that called for new thinking about the old questions. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, transformed the meaning of westward movement. The West was no longer weeks away from the East but days, and the kind of slow, difficult journey that the pre-war emigrant wagon trains had made was being replaced by something faster, more commercial, more ordinary. The frontier was not closing yet, but it was being redrawn, and the vision of the West that Greeley had championed for so long was having to adjust to the new realities of railroads and industrial agriculture and the beginnings of the cattle economy that would define the later West. Greeley himself had traveled west, in 1859, on a trip that gave him direct experience of the landscape he had been writing about for so long. He took the overland route part way and then the stagecoach service that was beginning to connect the coasts. He met Brigham Young in Salt Lake City. He saw the early mining camps of the Colorado Mountains. He traveled through landscapes of such scale and strangeness that even as practiced journalists I struggled to find the words for them. He wrote about all of it in the Tribune, and the resulting series of dispatches, collected in a book called An Overland Journey, is one of the more interesting documents of mid-19th century Western travel writing, combining practical observation with the particular quality of a man encountering with his body something he had previously known only with his mind. Part 8, The Great Journey West, in his own words. Imagine the light of a June morning in 1859, falling on the Kansas prairie in long golden angles from the east, illuminating grass that stretched to every horizon without interruption, grass and sky and the particular silence of the open plains that is not actually silence at all but rather the sound of wind across enormous distances, continuous and low, the breathing of a landscape too large for any human measurement. Horace Greeley was 48 years old when he made his overland journey to California, and everything about it was a revelation. Not because he was naive about the West, he had been writing about it for nearly 2 decades and had a detailed intellectual familiarity with its geography, its peoples, its possibilities, and dangers. But intellectual familiarity and physical presence are different things, profoundly and irreducibly different, and Greeley, who built his life on words and the power of words to approximate reality, seems to have been genuinely astonished by the degree to which the physical West exceeded the verbal West he had constructed on the pages of the Tribune. He traveled by train to St. Louis, then by stagecoach across Missouri and Kansas, then by the overland stage through Colorado, over the Rockies, across the Nevada desert, and eventually to California. The journey took months, involved conditions that were by turns merely uncomfortable and genuinely miserable, and gave him material that he processed into his dispatches with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years learning how to make facts interesting. The prairie impressed him first. He had expected openness, but he had not been prepared for the specific texture of it. The way the grass was not a simple green surface but a complex living system of different species at different heights, moving in patterns that changed with every shift of the wind. The soil was black and deep and rich in a way that the thin, rocky soils of New England had never been, and this richness was immediately apparent even to a man who had grown up in New Hampshire and spent his adult life in New York. The earth here was something different, something that spoke of potential in a completely physical way, before any words were attached to it. He wrote about this in terms that were both practical and lyrical. The Tribune's readers in the crowded cities of the East could feel, through his prose, the quality of that black soil under their feet, could sense the silence of the open distances, could understand in some bodily way what it might mean to be young and strong and facing such a landscape with the knowledge that it could be claimed and worked and made into something that would sustain a family for generations. This was exactly the vision he had been articulating editorially for years, and now he was seeing it directly and translating the directness of the seeing into language. Kansas, in 1859, was still bleeding from the guerrilla violence of the previous years. The territory had only just voted to enter the Union as a free state. It would be formally admitted in 1861, and the scars of the sectional conflict were visible in abandoned homesteads and in the cautious way people talked about certain things. Greeley wrote about this honestly, noting both the genuine possibility of the land and the damage that political violence had done to the communities trying to settle it. He was not producing promotional literature for a railroad or a land company. He was a journalist, and he wrote what he saw. The crossing of the Rockies was something else entirely. Greeley was not a man of great physical courage. He was sedentary by temperament, uncomfortable with physical risk, constitutionally unsuited to the kind of adventure that some travelers actively sought. The stage journey over the mountains and through the passes was hard and frightening in ways he described with a frankness that is actually quite charming. He was scared, the road was terrifying, the drops were enormous, and the horses were driven by men whose familiarity with the route seemed to him insufficient justification for the speed at which they traveled along precipices that made his stomach drop. He wrote all of this down, including the fear, and the writing is better for it. The Great Salt Lake Basin and the Mormon settlements surrounding it occupied several of his dispatches. Greeley was fascinated by the Mormon experiment, a religious community that had built, in a decade, a functioning civilization in a desert that most Americans considered uninhabitable. He met Brigham Young for an extended conversation, which he reported in detail, presenting Young with a combination of respect and skepticism that was characteristic of his best journalism. He was not willing to endorse polygamy, which he found genuinely repugnant. But he was willing to acknowledge the organizational genius of Young and the extraordinary achievement of the community he had led across the plains and established in the desert. The whole thing was, to Greeley's mind, a kind of extreme example of what human will and cooperative organization could accomplish in the Western landscape. The Nevada desert he found simply in thoroughly brutal heat and alkali dust and the particular desolation of a landscape that does not offer the eye any of the concessions that more forgiving geographies make. The stage moved through it as quickly as possible, which was not quickly enough. Greeley suffered from the heat, from the roughness of the road, from an injury to his leg that had occurred earlier in the journey and that was making him increasingly uncomfortable. He described the desert crossings in language that stripped away everything unnecessary, in a way that the desert itself strips away everything unnecessary, the prose becoming spare and flat and dry, matching the landscape. And then California. The San Joaquin Valley, and then the coastal ranges, and then San Francisco, where he arrived to find a city that had sprung up from essentially nothing in the decades since the gold rush, and that was already, by 1859, a genuinely cosmopolitan place, restaurants and opera houses and newspapers and theaters alongside the rougher elements of a boomtown still not entirely finished with boom. Greeley was received there as a celebrity, because he was, the editor of the New York Tribune, was one of the most recognizable figures in America, and San Francisco, which read newspapers with the particular hunger of a community trying to stay connected to the wider world, knew exactly who he was. He wrote about California's agriculture with almost evangelistic enthusiasm. The climate, the soil, the variety of crops that could be grown there, the opportunities for the kind of productive, independent farming that he had been holding up as an ideal for 2 decades, all of it seemed, in California, more completely present than anywhere he had seen. He was aware that the gold rush had transformed California's economy and culture in ways that were not entirely healthy, that the mining economy created dependence and violence and boom and bust cycles that were destructive of the stable community life he valued. But the agricultural possibilities of the state seemed to him to offer a corrective, and he said so in terms that were both specific and passionate. The journey home was by sea, around the Horn, and gave him time to reflect on what he had seen. The dispatches he had been sending back to the Tribune throughout the journey were being read by hundreds of thousands of people, and the responses he received, admiring letters from readers who felt they had traveled alongside him, requests for more information about specific areas he had mentioned, reports from people who had decided on the basis of his accounts to make their own Western journey, told him that the journey had accomplished something beyond his own education. It had brought the West into the living rooms and kitchens of people who might never make the physical journey, had made it real and specific and present in their imaginations, had done exactly what he had always believed good journalism should do, shrunk the distance between a reader and the reality they needed to understand. Part 9: The Tribune's Reach and the Nation's Imagination. To understand how thoroughly the New York Tribune shaped American culture in the middle decades of the 19th century, you have to understand what newspapers were in that era in a way that is somewhat difficult to recreate with modern intuitions about media. There was no radio. There was no television. There were no mass circulation magazines as we understand them. For most people in most places in America, the newspaper was the primary medium through which the wider world was made present. And the Tribune was not just any newspaper. It was, by the 1850s and 1860s, what its semi-weekly and weekly editions reached that mattered most, the weekly edition in particular, which was specifically designed and priced for distribution outside New York and which went, by various accounts, to virtually every state and territory in the country. Circulation figures from the mid-19th century are imprecise and contested, but the best estimates suggest that the Weekly Tribune was reaching somewhere between 200,000 and 280,000 subscribers at its peak, and that each copy was read by multiple people, so the actual readership was considerably larger than the subscription numbers suggest. The geography of that readership matters enormously. The Tribune's weekly edition was concentrated not in New York City but in the rural and small-town North and Midwest, in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Michigan and Wisconsin, in the farming communities of western New York and Pennsylvania, in the newer settlements of Iowa and Minnesota and the territories beyond. These were exactly the communities that were deciding where to go and what to do and what the country should be. And they were reading Horace Greeley. What this meant in practice was that Greeley's editorial positions on the major questions of the day, slavery, land policy, labor, immigration, westward expansion, were reaching and influencing the people whose choices would determine how those questions were answered. The homesteader in Indiana reading Greeley's arguments for the Homestead Act understood the issue in the terms Greeley had provided. The anti-slavery farmer in Ohio reading Greeley's coverage of the Kansas violence felt the moral urgency of the issue in the emotional register Greeley had established. The German immigrant in Wisconsin reading the Tribune's sympathetic coverage of European immigrants and its arguments for their full inclusion in American political life felt that he had an ally in the most influential newspaper editor in the country. The Homestead Act deserves a moment of particular attention in this context, because it represents the most direct legislative connection between Greeley's editorial vision and actual government policy. Greeley had been advocating for free public land for settlers for years, arguing that the federal government should grant land to actual settlers rather than selling it to speculators, that the public domain should be used to support the creation of the smallholder farming class that was the foundation of his democratic vision. The idea had been around in various forms since the 1840s, but it gained momentum in the 1850s as the Republican Party was forming and looking for policies that would distinguish it from both the Southern planter class and the Eastern commercial elite. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862 and signed by Lincoln, a piece of legislation that granted 160 acres of public land to any citizen or intended citizen who was willing to settle and improve it for 5 years. It was, in its ambitions, almost exactly what Greeley had been arguing for. And while its actual effects were more complicated than its promoters had anticipated, much of the best public land had already been granted to railroads, fraud in the homestead claims process was widespread, and 160 acres was often insufficient for viable farming in the drier parts of the West. It represented a genuine attempt to implement the vision of free land for free labor that had been central to Greeley's editorial project for 2 decades. The relationship between the Tribune and the Republican Party in the 1860s was both intimate and sometimes uncomfortably complicated. Greeley was not willing to be simply a party organ. He had built the Tribune's credibility partly on the basis of its independence, its willingness to criticize political allies as well as opponents, and he was not about to abandon that. But the convergence of his editorial positions with the Republican platform was real and significant, and both the party and the paper benefited from it in ways that were difficult to entirely separate from each other. The Tribune's literary and cultural journalism was also, in this period, making a significant contribution to American intellectual life. The paper had always covered literature and ideas seriously, and in the post-war period this coverage became more systematic and more influential. Reviews of major books in the Tribune could make or break reputations. Serialized fiction, the Tribune ran fiction alongside its news coverage in the manner of the era, reached an enormous audience. The paper's coverage of theater, art exhibitions, and public lectures helped to build and sustain the cultural life of the expanding American middle class. There is something worth pausing over here. something that is easy to miss if you focus only on the big political stories. Greeley believed, in a way that was fundamental to everything he did, that ordinary people had a right to and a capacity for engagement with serious ideas. He did not believe in the condescension that assumed working farmers and small-town craftsmen should be given simplified, digestible versions of cultural and intellectual life. He wrote for them as though they were intelligent adults who could handle complexity, who could follow an argument, who could be moved by a poem or a piece of serious prose in the same way that a Harvard professor could be moved. This was not universal in American journalism of the era, and it was one of the things that made the Tribune distinctive. The paper's correspondence network was itself a kind of intellectual community. Greeley received enormous quantities of mail, and he answered much of it personally, a practice that would be literally impossible to maintain by the 1870s, but that in the earlier years created genuine relationships with readers who felt that the editor of the Tribune was someone they actually knew, someone who had read their letter and thought about what they said and responded as one person to another. The letters from young men in Western farming communities, asking Greeley's advice about what they should read, where they should go, what they should do with their lives, are among the most poignant documents in the Tribune's archive. They reveal, more clearly than any circulation figure, what the paper meant to the people who read it, not merely a source of news but a kind of ongoing conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in their situation and genuinely committed to helping them think their way through it. By the late 1860s, the Tribune's weekly edition was beginning to face new competition, as regional newspapers in the Midwest and West grew more sophisticated and better resourced. The railroads and the telegraph had made it possible for papers in Chicago and Cincinnati and St. Louis to gather and process news with a speed and comprehensiveness that had previously only been available to New York papers. The era of national newspaper dominance centered on the eastern seaboard was not yet over, but it was beginning to show its limits, and Greeley, ever attentive to the broader media landscape, was watching these developments with the complex feelings of a man who had helped create the very conditions that were now challenging the institution he had built. Part 10: The Final Campaign and the Long Farewell. There is a particular kind of sorrow that attaches to the last ambitions of great people, the sense of watching someone reach for something that, in retrospect, we can see was just beyond their grasp, even as they could not quite see it themselves. Horace Greeley's final years were shadowed by exactly this quality, and to understand them fully is to understand something important not only about the man but about the limits of the kind of moral and political optimism that had sustained him through half a century of public life. In 1872, Horace Greeley ran for President of the United States. He was 61 years old. He had spent more than 30 years building one of the most influential newspapers in American history, had shaped public opinion on slavery and westward expansion and labor and a dozen other major questions, had argued with presidents and senators and been read by farmers and shopkeepers and immigrants across the length and breadth of the country. And he believed, genuinely believed, not as an exercise in vanity but as a considered political judgment, that he could win. The context in which this happened is important and somewhat complicated. Ulysses S. Grant had been president since 1869, winning the 1868 election as the obvious choice of the Republican Party and the country's gratitude for his leadership in ending the Civil War. But by 1872, Grant's administration was mired in corruption, not corruption that Grant himself had necessarily directed, but the kind of pervasive, systemic graft that tends to accumulate around a man who combines enormous power with a limited interest in the details of governance and an uncomfortable tendency to trust the wrong people. The Credit Mobilier scandal, which involved the fraudulent enrichment of railroad company insiders using funds from the federally subsidized Transcontinental Railroad, was beginning to break open. The Whiskey Ring, a conspiracy of liquor distillers, revenue officials, and Treasury Department employees to defraud the government of excise tax revenue, had not yet been exposed but was festering. The patronage system was functioning in ways that made serious people deeply uncomfortable. Out of this discomfort arose the liberal Republican movement, a coalition of Republicans who were disillusioned with Grant and who believed that reform, reconciliation with the South, and a generally less vigorous federal presence in Southern affairs was the path forward. The liberal Republicans were a heterogeneous group. Some were genuine reformers concerned with corruption and civil service reform. Some were former Whigs and conservatives uncomfortable with the radicalism of Reconstruction. Some were businessmen who believed that Grant's administration was creating an unstable political environment that was bad for commerce. They held a convention in Cincinnati in May 1872 and, in a development that surprised many observers, nominated Horace Greeley as their presidential candidate. This was an extraordinary thing, in several ways. Greeley had never run for office before in a serious way. He had made a brief, unsuccessful run for Congress in the late 1860s, filling an unexpired term, but had not been notably distinguished in that role. He was a newspaper editor, a writer, a public intellectual, not a politician. He had none of the organizational infrastructure that serious presidential candidates required. He was also, by 1872, a genuinely controversial figure in ways that made the coalition building necessary for a presidential run extremely difficult. The Democratic Party, desperate after a decade of defeat and searching for any path back to relevance, made the remarkable decision to endorse Greeley as well, nominating him at their own convention, swallowing whatever ideological objections they had to a lifelong Republican anti-slavery editor in the interest of having a candidate who might actually be able to challenge Grant. The result was one of the stranger political coalitions in American history. A man who had spent 30 years arguing that the Democratic Party was the party of slavery and national division was now the presidential candidate of both the breakaway Republicans and the Democrats. Greeley campaigned with his characteristic energy and directness. He gave speeches, wrote articles, traveled, met with party leaders, tried to build the coalition that the nomination required. He was not naturally suited to the retail politics of campaigning, the glad-handing, the strategic vagueness, the willingness to tell different audiences slightly different things, and his instinct to say exactly what he thought, which had served him well as an editor, was sometimes a liability on the campaign trail. He made statements that could be and were taken out of context. He said things in one speech that complicated things he had said in another. He was honest in ways that were politically inconvenient. The Republican Party mobilized against him with enormous effectiveness. Grant's campaign painted Greeley as a crank, a naif, a man whose record of eccentric causes, his early enthusiasm for utopian communities, his various dietary enthusiasms, his support for the bail bond of Jefferson Davis, could be assembled into a portrait of someone who was fundamentally unsuited for serious executive responsibility. The cartoonist Thomas Nast, whose work in Harper's Weekly had helped define the visual vocabulary of American political commentary, produced a series of devastating caricatures of Greeley that fixed a particular image of him in the public mind: the rumpled, wide-eyed, impractical idealist, well-meaning but not quite serious, not quite presidential. The campaign was also brutal in a more personal way. Greeley had put himself forward as a public figure in the most complete possible way, and the public response included attacks on him that went far beyond normal political criticism. His personal character, his family life, his mental stability, all of it was subjected to a kind of scrutiny and abuse that he had not anticipated, or perhaps had not allowed himself to anticipate. He was a man who had spent 30 years dishing out sharp editorial criticism of other people, and he had known intellectually that he would be on the receiving end of similar treatment once he entered the arena as a candidate rather than a commentator. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it personally were different things. The election of 1872 was, by any measure, a catastrophe for Greeley. Grant won by an enormous margin, more than 55% of the popular vote to Greeley's less than 44%, and an electoral college landslide of 286 to 66. Greeley carried only 6 states, all in the South or the border region, and the scale of the defeat was so comprehensive that it left no room for the consolations that a narrower loss might have permitted. He had not merely lost. He had been repudiated. He returned to the Tribune after the election, resuming his editorial duties as if by the sheer force of routine he could restore himself to some version of the person he had been before. But the force was not there. The letters he wrote in November 1872 are some of the most painful documents in his archive, a man clearly struggling, clearly exhausted, clearly uncertain whether he had the resources to continue. He wrote about grief and about defeat and about the sense that his life's work was somehow being called into question, not by the election result itself but by everything the campaign had revealed about how he was perceived by the very public he had spent 30 years trying to serve. There was also a practical crisis at the Tribune. In his absence during the campaign, the paper's management had been making decisions he had not approved, and his return found him in conflict with colleagues about the direction of the paper he had built. He had given so much of himself to the presidential run that the paper itself had slipped partially from his control, and the effort of reclaiming it, on top of everything else, was simply more than he had. On November 29, 1872, less than a month after the election and just days after his wife's death, Horace Greeley died. He was 61 years old. The cause was given as exhaustion and brain inflammation, what we might today describe as a complete physical and psychological collapse, the failure of a system that had been running too long on too little. He died at a private sanitarium in Pleasantville, New York, where he had been taken when it became clear that he could no longer care for himself. He died as he had lived in some ways, surrounded by complexity, by controversy, by the sense of a man who had never quite finished what he had started. The farmer in Illinois who had read the Tribune for 20 years and could trace his decision to buy land in the West partly to Greeley's editorials. The immigrant in Wisconsin who had found in the Tribune's coverage of European politics a connection to the world he had left behind and in its American politics a guide to the world he was trying to enter. The young woman in Ohio who had read Margaret Fuller's literary criticism in the Tribune's pages and found there the first serious engagement with women's intellectual lives that she had ever encountered in print. These were the people Greeley had written for, and they were the people who mourned him most genuinely. His body was taken to New York City and lay in state at City Hall, where thousands of people came to pay their respects. The funeral procession was one of the largest the city had seen. President Grant attended the funeral, a gesture that was widely noted and that perhaps said something about the relationship between the two men's legacies. Grant, who had defeated Greeley so decisively and whose presidency would end in a welter of scandal, coming to pay respect to the editor who had challenged him and lost. Part 11: The Legacy That Traveled West. What does a legacy look like when it has spread across a continent? When the ideas a man spent his life propagating have become so thoroughly woven into the assumptions of the culture that people no longer trace them back to their source, the way you stop noticing the foundations of a house after you have lived in it long enough? Horace Greeley's legacy is, in this sense, a particularly difficult thing to see clearly, because it is in so many ways invisible through absorption, taken into the body of American culture so completely that it no longer announces itself as a foreign element. The idea that the West offered a second chance. The idea that working people deserved serious journalism that treated them as capable of engaging with complex ideas. The idea that a newspaper should stand for something beyond its own commercial interests. The idea that slavery was not merely economically inefficient but morally wrong. These were not universal assumptions in American culture when Greeley began his work. By the time he finished, they were much closer to being so. The Homestead Act of 1862, which Greeley had advocated for so energetically, set in motion one of the largest voluntary migrations in human history. Between 1862 and 1900, some 600,000 claims were filed under the Homestead Act, representing millions of individuals and families who moved to the lands of the Great Plains, the mountains, and the territories beyond. The act did not always deliver what it promised. The 160-acre allotment was often insufficient in the arid conditions of the Western Plains. Fraud was rampant. Native peoples were systematically dispossessed to make the land available for settlement, but as a movement of human beings responding to a vision of possibility, it was enormous. How many of those homesteaders had been shaped, directly or indirectly, by reading the Tribune's weekly edition in the years before they made their decision? There is no way to count this precisely, and the question of causation in mass migrations is never simple. People move for complex reasons, and the decision to uproot a family and travel 1,000 miles to an unknown landscape is not made because of a single editorial, however powerful. But the Tribune's role in forming the cultural imagination within which those decisions were made, in establishing the West as a legitimate aspiration, in making westward migration feel like courage rather than desperation, was real and significant. The image of the West that Greeley helped create also shaped American literature and art in ways that are still present today. The painters of the Hudson River School and their successors who turned their attention to the West, Albert Bierstadt with his enormous, luminous canvases of the Rockies and Yosemite, Frederick Remington with his images of cowboys and cavalry, were working in a cultural context that journalism like Greeley's had helped to establish. The West is a place of sublime landscape and human possibility. The West is the terrain on which American character was formed and tested. The West is the setting for a national mythology of freedom and reinvention. All of this was being assembled simultaneously by journalists and painters and novelists, and Greeley was one of the most significant of the journalists. The literary West that would flourish in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, Bret Harte's California mining stories, Mark Twain's Roughing It, Owen Wister's The Virginian, the dime novels that would reach millions of readers with their formulaic but powerfully resonant Western narratives, was built on a cultural foundation that figures like Greeley had helped to lay. The cowboy hero, the frontier town, the landscape of magnificent and indifferent nature against which human smallness and human courage were simultaneously displayed, these were images that had been assembling themselves in American culture since before Greeley began writing, but his journalism was part of the assembly, part of the process by which the actual West was transformed into the imagined West that would eventually become one of the most powerful and persistent mythologies in the world. There is also Greeley's legacy in journalism itself, which is perhaps the most concrete and traceable of his contributions. The model of the Tribune, the serious, idea-driven newspaper that combined political advocacy with genuine reporting, that tried to cover both the national and the international scene with equal seriousness, that treated its readership as intelligent adults and held itself to standards of both factual accuracy and moral coherence, was enormously influential on the development of American journalism in the later 19th century. The editors who came after Greeley, at the Tribune and at other papers, were shaped by the model he had established, even when they were reacting against specific aspects of it. The tradition of the editor as public intellectual, as someone whose personal views and moral commitments were part of what readers paid for, who was understood to be something more than a neutral transmitter of information, owes a great deal to Greeley. This tradition would produce, in subsequent generations, figures like E.W. Scripps, William Randolph Hearst in a more lurid form, and eventually the tradition of editorial journalism that still exists, in diminished form, in American newspapers today. In the West itself, the legacy is visible in the names on maps, the towns and counties and rivers named after the settlers who came following visions that journalism helped to shape. It is visible in the courthouse squares of small Midwestern towns, in the churches that the farming communities built as soon as they had built their houses, in the schools and libraries that followed close behind. The civilization that grew up on the prairie grass in the decades after the Civil War was not the product of any single vision, but the vision of productive, democratic, free labor settlement that Greeley had championed was present in it, woven into the fabric of communities whose members might not have known his name but were living the life he had imagined for them. There is a quieter part of the legacy worth noting, too. Greeley was, throughout his career, a consistent advocate for the rights of working people, not in the systematic, theoretically rigorous way that the emerging labor movement would eventually develop, but in the practical, journalistic way of a man who reported on the conditions of workers and argued that those conditions were often unjust and should be changed. The Tribune covered labor disputes, published letters from factory workers describing their conditions, ran editorials arguing for higher wages and shorter working hours, treated the emerging conflict between industrial capital and industrial labor as a genuine moral question rather than a purely economic one. This aspect of Greeley's legacy is sometimes forgotten in the dominant narrative about him, which tends to focus on westward expansion and anti-slavery journalism. But the two concerns were not separate in his mind. The vision of free labor, of men and women who worked for themselves, or who chose their employers and could leave if those employers treated them unjustly, who had enough economic security to participate fully in democratic life, was the vision that connected his anti-slavery journalism with his coverage of the labor question and with his advocacy for Western homesteading. All three were facets of the same fundamental belief, that human beings had a right to the fruits of their own labor and to the dignity of economic independence. It is a vision with a complicated relationship to the capitalism that was simultaneously transforming American life. Greeley was not anti-capitalist in any systematic sense. He believed in property, in markets, in the productive power of individual enterprise. But he believed in all of these things in the context of a broadly equitable distribution of their benefits, and he was uncomfortable, sometimes very uncomfortable, with the concentration of wealth and power that industrialism was producing. The tension between his faith in American economic dynamism and his alarm at its consequences was never fully resolved in his thinking, because it was a tension that American culture has never fully resolved either. Part 12, The Meaning of a Life Spent in Words. Late evening comes to Chappaqua differently than it comes to the city. The light goes slowly, spreading itself thin across the open sky above the fields, the colors changing from gold to copper to a deep, settling blue that is not yet dark but is already something beyond day. The farmhouse where Mary Greeley spent her last years would have known this light, and the children who had not lived to see it would have been present in it anyway, the way the dead are always present in the places where they were loved. Horace Greeley is buried in Brooklyn, in the Greenwood Cemetery, a place that in the 19th century was considered one of the great public landscapes of the East, its rolling hills and careful plantings and quiet paths making it a place of both mourning and, in a way that the Victorians understood clearly, a kind of instruction in the relationship between human life and natural continuity. Many of the significant figures of 19th-century American public life are buried there. Greeley's grave is not the grandest in the place, but it is not forgotten. People still come to find it. What does it mean to spend a life in words? What is the measure of it, when the words are gone, when the paper they were printed on has crumbled or been archived in boxes in university libraries that few people visit, when the debates they inflamed have been settled or have transformed into other debates, when the people they moved and the decisions they influenced are themselves a century and a half in the past? Greeley himself thought about this question, at least in his more reflective moments. He wrote, at various points in his life, about the transience of journalism, about the fact that a newspaper was, by its nature, a document that people read once and threw away, that its influence was real but difficult to trace, that the editor who shaped the public mind left fewer durable marks than the novelist or the philosopher or the statesman whose work could be returned to and reread and reconsidered. He was not particularly troubled by this, or he tried not to be. He believed that the work mattered in the moment of its doing, that shaping public conversation when the conversation needed to be shaped was its own justification, regardless of whether future generations could see the shaping. There is something worth honoring in this attitude, a kind of vocational humility that is sometimes missing from the accounts of people who work in public life. Greeley was ambitious, enormously ambitious, and the presidential campaign of 1872 shows that the ambition could lead him in directions that his better judgment might have counseled against. But at the foundation of his public life was something that looks more like service than ambition, a genuine belief that the words he spent his life producing were in the service of other people's understanding, other people's choices, other people's possibilities. The young man who arrived in New York in 1831 with $10 and his skill with type and his enormous capacity for absorbing and processing information could not have imagined, in any precise sense, what the next 40 years would bring. He could not have imagined the Tribune at the height of its influence, reaching into the homes of 200,000 families. He could not have imagined the conversation with Lincoln about the Emancipation Proclamation, the journey over the Rockies by stagecoach, the funeral with the president in attendance. He could not have imagined the defeat, either, or the grief, or the exhaustion that killed him before he was old. But in some broader sense, he did imagine it. The capacity that allowed him to persist through the years of uncertainty and poverty and failure, that carried him from the failed Morning Post to the enduring Tribune, that sustained him through the losses and the controversies and the political disappointments, that capacity was a form of imagination, a belief in a future that was not yet real. A conviction that the words being written in lamplit rooms and set in type by ink-stained hands were part of something that would matter. The phrase "goes west, young man" carries within it more than a direction. It carries within it a whole philosophy of possibility, the belief that the world is not fixed, that circumstances can be changed, that the place where you begin is not necessarily the place where you end, that the horizon you can see is not the limit of what exists. This philosophy, in its American 19th-century form, was entangled with deeply problematic aspects of national life, the displacement of indigenous peoples, the brutal conditions of frontier settlement, the ways in which the promise of the West was never equally available to people of different races and genders. These entanglements are real and they should not be minimized. But the philosophy itself, the faith in possibility, the refusal to accept that what exists is all that can exist, the belief that the work of making a more just and more free world is always unfinished and always worth continuing, this is not simply a product of westward expansion or of one historical moment. It is something older and more durable, and Horace Greeley, with all his contradictions and inadequacies, was one of the people through whom it expressed itself most powerfully in the middle decades of the 19th century. The Tribune's offices on Nassau Street are gone now, replaced by the anonymous glass and steel of the modern financial district. The weekly edition that traveled to farmhouses in Iowa and Ohio and Minnesota has no modern equivalent. The communication landscape it inhabited has been transformed utterly by technologies that Greeley could not have imagined, that would have amazed and perhaps troubled him with the speed and fragmentation they have brought to public conversation. The West itself has changed entirely, settled, developed, urbanized in some parts, still struggling in others, its native people still living with the consequences of the dispossession that Greeley's vision helped to accelerate. The ink is long dry on those old Tribune pages. The type that Greeley learned to set in the cold print shop in Vermont, the letters arranged one by one into words and sentences and paragraphs, has been scattered and melted down and remade 100 times over. But the words that were built from that type went out into the world and found their readers, and some of those readers made different decisions because of what they read, and some of those decisions had consequences that rippled outward through decades and generations, touching lives that never knew the name of the editor who had set the words in motion. That is what it means to spend a life in words. Not to carve your name in stone, but to pour your ideas into the flowing current of other people's thinking, and to trust the current to carry them somewhere worth going. Somewhere west. Closing meditation. You have traveled far tonight. Across the cold print shops of Vermont and the crowded, ink-smelling offices of Nassau Street. Across the Kansas prairie in golden June light, and over the mountains in a lurching stagecoach, and through the long, difficult years when the country was deciding what it would be and one man kept writing, kept arguing, kept believing that the words mattered. Feel where you are resting. The weight of your body against the surface beneath you. The coolness or warmth of the air around you. The particular quality of the dark behind your closed eyes, not an absence but a presence, soft and surrounding and kind. Right now, you are in the one place that needs nothing from you. You are in the moment before sleep, which is its own kind of open country, wide and quiet and without fences, where the mind can move without purpose or destination, following whatever current takes it. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the muscles of your face release around the eyes, across the forehead, along the jaw. Let your hands lie heavy and still. There is nothing to hold. Nothing to carry. The night is long and generous and it asks only that you rest. Think, if you like, of that Kansas prairie in the June morning light. The grass moving in slow patterns with the wind. The sky enormous overhead. The horizon further than any eye can follow. And somewhere in that landscape, perhaps, the faint wheel ruts of wagon tracks, pressed into the earth by people who went west when the word west still meant something unwritten, still meant the place where the story continued. We do not know their names. Most of them left no record. But they made the journey, through the difficulty and the beauty of it, and they arrived somewhere, and they built something, and the country they built it in is the country you are resting in tonight. Let sleep come now, easy and unhurried. The story has been told. The words have found their way. The night is still and the distance is wide and there is nowhere you need to go until morning. Rest now. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.